Hi, welcome to another episode of Such a Nightmare, Conversations about Horror. My name is Katherine Troyer, and joining me is Anthony Tresca.
Hi there.
This is a podcast devoted to thoughtful discussions about that fine line between the horrific and the horrible. In each episode, we look at a specific horror text that is, for better or worse, giving us nightmares.
And we are so very, very excited to have you joining us today for our episode over 2000's American Psycho. So I do want to just begin by apologizing for any sound things that you hear on my end. There's currently construction going on outside my apartment that I cannot ask them to just stop. Unfortunately, that's not how it works. So if there's any background noise, it's on me because there's construction.
Yeah, the only way that you would be able to make them stop is if you were Bateman and that wealthy.
That's true.
Then you could do whatever you wanted, including, eating people.
No consequences when you're rich.
True story. We say without ever knowing whether or not that's reality.
Yeah, I mean, I just assume, in
my mind's eye, that's what the rich version of me looks like, right? Is without any sort of penalties for life. Okay, so which is what this entire film is about. So if you look at the scholarship on American Psycho, you can find quite a bit, because this is a cult classic, and it's a cult classic based on a book that also has a very strong following. And so I was telling Anthony prior to the start of our recording that I don't really have, like I do in some episodes, a very fixed, singular critical lens that I want to look at. But I do want to just kind of bring in some of the discussions that people are having about this film. One of the people who has written about American Psycho is Naomi Mandel, but she's actually focused a little bit more on the novel. And so this is from an edited collection called Novels of the Contemporary Extreme. And I want to start there, even though we very explicitly said that we're not going to be talking about Bret Easton Ellis's novel, because of the fact that a lot of the controversy about this film stems from the fact that people feel so very conflicted about the book. The book is described by some as one of the most shockingly violent novels ever published. And of course, Ellis will tell you, well, that's not actually what he was trying to do. He wasn't necessarily trying to have this like super controversial book. He didn't even necessarily think it was going to be like the most ultimate horror text ever. And I think that, Mary Herron, in needing to think about how she's going to adapt the film, had to think, if this book has been labeled as the most shockingly violent novel ever published, what do I do with that in terms of the film?
It's certainly a challenge, but also, since film is such a visual medium, it's also it also presents very clear and distinct advantages that a book might not have, because in a book, you can do a lot with words, and words can be very, very descriptive, but picture tells 1,000 words, and so a moving picture, that's a lot of words.
Yes, and so if people were scandalized by reading about some of the things that Bateman does, one of the questions of adaptation is, do we go there, right? Do we just say, well, let's just blow them out of the water with the images, or do we, manage to be more circumspect? And I think that we get both in the film, right? Because we have, the opening where we think it's, drops of blood, and then we realize it's raspberry sauce. We go from that to, an actual just, apartment filled with death and destruction. So
exactly. Yeah, of course. As you do.
As one does. The other texts that I just want to kind of give a shout out to are in an article by Deborah Knight and George McKnight in an edited collection called Dark Thoughts, Philosophic Reflections on Cinematic Horror. They talk about how we're supposed to morally evaluate this film, and that one of the things that makes it challenging is that we don't really have anyone that we can cling to in this film as our sort of beacon of good. We do have people like Willem Dafoe's character, but he's not, he's not entirely that like outstanding police officer who's the good guy that's, you know, shining, because he's not in it enough. And so I think what's interesting about the two McKnight's articles is this reminder that a lot of times in text with monsters, we are given an example of who we're supposed to compare the monster to see them as a monster. Even in Frankenstein, you know, where you have to decide if Frankenstein's creature is actually truly a monster, the whole book is Frankenstein doctor saying, I have to tell you about how good I was so that you can understand how terrible this creature was. And then the creature's like, I know what you just heard, but let me tell you some other thoughts. But we don't get that in American Psycho. We have icky, ickier, and ickiest, and there's really no there's no way to evaluate our monster, which I think is a really intriguing way to make this film.
Well, I think by not including directly in the film itself a beacon of good, I think that you're then left to, as an audience member, try to yourself be that beacon of moral good you make, or like whatever your moral good is. So it's obviously an objective, and for every single person it's going to be different, like how you evaluate this character based on what your moral good is. I would hope that most people out there, their sense of moral good is like that a lot of the things that Patrick Bateman does are pretty bad, like really bad. But you know, I guess everyone would be different, and so that could be a bit of a troubling thing by leaving it to just be kind of up to the audience to evaluate it itself.
You know, I think it's really interesting that you said that, because I'm not sure I entirely agree, at least from my viewing experience. So I didn't turn to myself as the moral compass or as the sort of beacon of good, because I felt like the film was saying that the only reason you're not doing these things is because this is not the life you're currently living. And so
I think that's true. I think that the two can be true at the same time.
So I guess, like, I didn't see myself as being better. I just didn't see myself as being in the story, if that makes sense. Which I think fits with a lot of people's readings, in that a lot of people will tell you that, you know, Bateman is not the real issue, right? The real issue is the culture of the 80s and 90s, that this film is the American culture of the 80s and 90s that this film is depicting, right? That like, is the real... Yeah. It's
satirizing this, like, toxic, consumer-heavy culture, this business-minded world where all that matters is bottom lines, and they don't have any real problems, so they have to make up their own problems, like the comparing of the business cards. What a problem to have. I wish my biggest problem in life was that I didn't choose the correct font on my business card.
Do you know, that is my... I'm sure it's because I love office supplies so much, but that is my favorite scene.
It's a great scene.
And it's the scene that I remember between viewings, so I don't always remember everything that happens in the film, because I don't watch this film but probably every 4 or 5 years. But that's the one scene that I remember, and I think it's... I don't know what it says about me that that's the one scene I remember, but yeah, I think it's so important that, you know, for them, that is, for Bateman, right, that is just as much of a, like, life and death situation as is, you know, pursuing a prostitute down the stairs.
The stakes of that scene are really felt and articulated by how the camera is framed, the music, and just how seriously everyone in that room is taking this exchange that's going on, this clear, like, power struggle that's happening between these men.
And I will say that moment was the one point where I did feel myself being put into the situation, right? Because, like, I was also evaluating which card I personally thought was the best. And so, you know, I think that for a scene where really nothing is happening, it might be one of the best examples of how to, like you said, use the cinematography and the acting and the music and mise-en-scène to create a ultimate stakes situation in a boardroom.
In a boardroom over nothing. It's not, we don't even, one of the things I think is really, really interesting about this movie is, though it's set in this business office type of location, you don't see them do any work, because that's not really what's important in their lives. I guess their work is just their way to secure money, which will allow them to have their lifestyle, which will allow them to be able to get away with doing whatever they want to do, and go to these fancy clubs and get high all the time and be constantly drunk, these prostitutes come in and film your sex lives and put it out there, and you get to do all this stuff, and that's why you do the work, and that's why it's there.
And I think it's because of something you said earlier, and that is that this is a film about consumption, not production. Right? So
Right.
The last article I want to briefly mention is by Christina Lee, and it's in the book Murders and Acquisitions, which of course is, direct quote from the film. And she begins her article, which is about serial consumption in American Psycho, by giving a quote from Jeffrey Dahmer, who said, "My consuming lust was to experience their bodies. I viewed them as objects to strangers." And so that's from one of the many interviews that was done after Dahmer was convicted. And of course, he murdered 17 people between 1978 and 1991. And she starts there, and then later she says,
Robert Bateman would be proud at her use of that quote.
I mean, it's eerie how appropriate that quote is, right? To have that be an actual quote from a serial killer.
Yeah.
And she says later, right, in American Psycho, as everything has a price, everything can therefore be acquired, expended, and discarded. The narrative evokes all possible meanings of the word consume: to purchase or possess, to eat, and to destroy, all articulate a confused consumerism that has run out of control and exceeded all boundaries. And to go back to what you said, I think one of the really interesting things is we do get to see that there is absolutely no production happening on the part of these.
It's the worst parts of capitalism, is that you only exist to consume. That's the only thing that's important. It's just the continued consumption to fuel and just bolster this economy.
And we see even with Defoe's character, right, like the one person who should be doing something, right, because he's investigating the case, nothing ever comes of it. So that we see that in this society, which is certainly satirical, but also an experience that many people may have had in the 80s and 90s especially.
It's a slightly heightened version of reality.
Yes, exactly. And so what are we supposed to do with this reminder that, like you said, in this capitalistic society, it doesn't matter if you produce, so long as you are capable of consuming.
I think that this film is very similar to another film that came out around a similar time, Fight Club, in the sense that they're both critiquing this similar culture and the similar toxic environment and the similar this toxic masculinity and these really fragile, delicate concepts like that. But I think where this film ultimately succeeds for me, where Fight Club I think comes off as more of a kind of a sick, twisted affirmation of that toxic masculinity, and it ultimately glorifies that character. I think that you can't come away from American Psycho and say, yeah, I think that the camera and the cinematography and the script were really glorifying Patrick Bateman. I think that part of that is because it's directed by a woman, whereas Fight Club was not, and there's still some kind of creepy male gazy things that slip in there, and some subliminal things that are happening. Whereas with Mary Harron, that is not in there at all. This is not glamorizing anything. It may be shot beautifully, but it isn't always intended to disturb you and be as alienating as possible.
Yes, I think that's a fantastic point. I think about the scene where he's peeling off his face mask, right? And like you said, it's beautifully shot, and Christian Bale is depicted very beautifully in that film. But there's something so profoundly disturbing that you're not wanting to be him. And I think about the fact that we make jokes still to this day about the first rule of Fight Club is, you don't talk about Fight Club. Well, we make comments about that, indicating that we're part of a fight club, right? Even though none of us are, but we use that phrase. None of us go, the first rule of being a serial killer is, there's not that same sort of acceptance, like you said, of what is or not acceptable.
You want to be in the fight club.
Yeah, you do.
That's the implication of that line, and that reference is that you're a part of this club, and that this idea of this closed-minded group of this that is there to support each other is something that you want. And that's, if you think about what you're really saying when you quote that line casually, it's a bit weird. Yeah. It's a bit weird that we've all suddenly gotten on board with being in this dude bro, toxic masculinity, alt-right hate group.
Yeah. And I want to go back to your statement about this being a film directed by a woman, because I think I find that this conversation comes up a lot, not just but with American Psycho, but just kind of in general, of like, can one identify, if you were just presented with a film, could you identify whether or not it was by a male or female director? And like, I've been asked this question before, and the answer is you know, right? Like, yes and no, kind of, not really, but a little bit, right? And I think it goes back more to, I don't think you can say, well, this was a film about, you know, delightfully soft kittens, therefore it must have been done by a woman, because we have things like American Psycho and The Hurt Locker and things like that. But I think you can see oftentimes less use of things that we have been taught are just, quote, normal. Like you said, the male gaze, where, you know, one of the things that is done with Bateman's character in a way that I'm not sure would have happened with a male director is that his entire body is ours for consumption.
You were talking about this earlier about with the face mask, of like why you're seeing that sequence and you don't want to be them. And I had a thought. It's like he's presented almost as this like statuesque, like he's very much like a Greek statue, which Greek statues are kind of alienating in when you just look at them, because they're representing this like peak of humanity that is pretty much unattainable just by regular standards. They're just off color enough that they're not exactly you, and it's just not human enough to be a little creepy, where you're like, it's just a little too defined, it's just a little too smooth, a little too polished, that you're like, I don't recognize that as me. It's alienating. And that is exactly how Patrick Bateman is framed in this movie every time you see him. He's just a little too polished, a little too put together. And so you're like, I don't know, he's not like us. He's not us.
Yeah, and there. So on the one hand, I think, right, you're absolutely correct that we have him being depicted. So if we go back to like the difference between Greek versus Roman art, right, it is the fact that the Greek art was this ideal that was celebrated because it couldn't actually be replicated in real life. And so he feels artificial, and we actually see that he is artificial inside and outside, right? That his like that whole discussion about his regiment care, or his care regiment, you know, is letting us know that everything that we're seeing has been carefully crafted. But at the same time, we're kind of having this gaze of him that is not the traditional way that the camera has often depicted male characters, right? So if we go to the male gaze concept is not new, right? Arguably, any culture that's been patriarchal has probably had somewhat of a male gaze in their artwork. But Laura Mulvey really coined that term in film criticism to talk about the psychology of scopophilia, right? The pleasure of looking. And there's this weird way in which American Psycho manages to both repel us. We don't want to look because he's so alien, but at the same time, he's being depicted as very beautiful. There's a lot of shots of him that are full body shots that feel very voyeuristic, right? Like, but don't you want to look at him? And again, you know, some of that's because Christian Bale is objectively a very beautiful person, but the film and the lens of the film makes him somebody that you want to both appreciate consuming, but also you're a bit repulsed by your consumption.
Yeah. Kind of like capitalism. And like this kind of the system that he himself finds himself to be just another cog in. It's this like all you exist to do is consume. And so this film takes that to the next level. He's like, all you can do is consume. Well, what happens when you're so rich that you can easily consume things beyond everyone else's wildest dreams? Well, the next natural step in this, oh, I can't curse on this. The next natural step in this effed up cycle is to just keep going, consuming more and more grander and grander, more intense things, which is exactly what we see his character do throughout the film.
But I'm so glad that you mentioned this phrase, the cog in the machine, because of course one of the running jokes that reaches its sort of zenith there at the end is the fact that he's constantly being mistaken for someone else, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we see that he really is, just as viable of a candidate for consumption as is anyone else. And so I want to go back to what you said at the very beginning, right? That like perhaps the moral beacon is us, or that's the only moral beacon we can find. But perhaps because we are consuming him this entire film ourselves, right? We realize that we're just as monstrous, and that this whole experience, and perhaps like just watching films, right, is itself also a sort of monstrous consumption.
And perhaps maybe even then, if we want to take this a step farther, then perhaps the true monster in it is not any individual. It's not any one person. It's rather a monstrous society, a monstrous system, a monstrous way of being.
Yes.
And you are left to grapple with the fact that, how are you watching this movie? You probably had to pay for it, didn't you? Oh, so you're just consuming. You're watching this criticism of consumption, of mass consumption, of just being one of hundreds of millions of thousands of however many people, and you're just one of those in watching this film.
And not only are you paying for the film, right, but the actual, like, the process of film going, if you think about it, if you think about the fact that when we watch a film, we are allowed to intrude upon the private lives of admittedly fictional characters, but we're in their home, we're in their bathroom, we're in their bedroom, right? Mm-hmm. We're consuming them. And that's just what you do, right? Like we should be able to experience the pleasure of looking. And I think that this film reminds us that there's something a little creepy about being a film viewer.
And I think that is another, you mentioned a little earlier that it was voyeuristic in a lot of the shots. And usually voyeurism is, when it's strongly used in film, particularly horror films, voyeurism is usually not a thing that produces comfort in an audience member. Because when you use voyeuristic camera techniques, you're breaking the suspension of disbelief and you're asking the audience to put themselves you're either doing one of two things. You're either taking them really, really far in and being like, look, you are a part of this now. Or it's like making you realize, oh, wait, I'm watching a film. Mm-hmm. And so it can either serve to alienate or put you really inside the film and what is going on. And the fun thing about this film, and why I think it's so good, is you don't want either of those options.
Yes.
You don't want either of those options with these characters and these situations that you're being presented with. Because if you go along with it, then you are complacent. Your voyeurism and your viewing is complacency and acceptance, and means that you are a part of this. But your alienation is not good either, because alienation and othering, it leads to groupthink and just puts you right back in the same situation again.
Bateman says that he feels alienated and disconnected, right? That's why he's able to comfortably do the things he does. So either you get to be, a cog in the machine, or Bateman, which you then realize is a cog in the machine, right?
Another cog in a larger machine, because you can't escape the system.
And I think you said, and that's why this film works so well. And I think that's the truth, is that this is a film that deserves to still be talked about, that has an incredible cult following, because of the fact that I can think of very few other films or texts period that manage to truly show you a spectrum, and to make you not want to experience either end, but to realize you are experiencing them anyway.
Mm-hmm. Whether you like it or not, both of these are true at the same time, and neither of these things are good. And when you apply it to your own life, which I think the film does kind of force you to do, you're like, oh, geez, I'm really doing this deep dive and being completely honest with myself. I am in a similar place as Patrick Bateman. I just don't have the same means and ability to maybe do this. And that's not all. And like, then you're like, would I do it? And then you tell yourself, of course you wouldn't.
Right.
But I'm sure that people in all of these other places where terrible things have happened never thought they would do it either. And so it forces you to deal with really uncomfortable questions about yourself and like your reality.
And we see this spectrum, right, of things that I think we've all been guilty of, to the extreme of things that hopefully anyone listening to this podcast is not guilty of, right? So like all of us have engaged in conversation with strangers that is frivolous and not entirely truthful. Even if it's just something like, how are you? Fine. Right? Are you actually fine? Probably not, right? And so maybe you're not lying to, a model about how, because you're trying to lure her up to your apartment to kill her, right? Maybe you're not doing that. But if you interact with some strangers at a club, you're probably not being entirely truthful, because why should you? They're not a real people to you. So all of us have done something like that, or we've had petty work dynamics, or, we talk smack about a colleague, or we are not always as thankful to our office administrators as we should be, right? Like there's something like that. And so we have to ask ourselves, if Bateman does all the things he does because he can get away with it, and we do the minor things he does, right? If we had those opportunities, where would we draw the line?
Yeah, and I think that this film also does similar analysis of capitalism and like this inherent greed. There's been a lot of recent studies that have come out about how earning money and cash can be just as addictive as any horrible drug. It can be just as addictive as heroin, crack, all of these drugs, like alcohol, can be just as addictive as that. And because once you get this pleasure that's coming in, money is a type of pleasure, it gives you access to things, it allows you to do more, it can propel you to a higher social status, it can be addicting. And thus why we have these really rich, for the large part, they are men, who have an already overwhelming amount of money, but just still seem to want more and more and keep finding new ways to exploit loopholes to get more money. And that's what you see with Patrick and the people in his circle. And that's an uncomfortable thing.
And I think viewing this film today, it is a little harder to say, but this isn't real. When we have people like Weinstein, and we have these documentaries coming out and these tell-alls, and even things like, all the news that's happening right now about Ellen DeGeneres and like whether or not her work place is a toxic environment, but she's such a lovely person, right? I mean, we've reached a point where we are realizing that maybe not everyone has killed a whole bunch of women in an empty apartment, but that again, the more money you have, the more money you're going to want, in part because the more you can do whatever you want, which when you're on something, you don't feel the need to be circumspect, right? You can just do whatever you want because you don't see consequences. That's why you're not allowed to drink and drive, right? You don't see consequences when you're drunk that you would otherwise. So how would you see consequences when you're addicted to money?
And I mean, you see this is perpetuated and even further perpetuated today. I mean, sitting in the current White House is President Donald Trump, who famously said that when you're rich, you can do whatever you want. They let you do whatever you want, referring to taking advantage of women. And that is a message that apparently resonated with a great deal of the country, because it was, despite him coming out and that being a thing that is publicly known, and there's video evidence of him saying it, people don't really seem to care. So maybe deep down, we already and have always known that this is what the system is and this is what the system allows, but we're kind of part of it, and we're being complacent in this monstrous system by not doing anything about it, electing those people to the highest office in the land.
And, I haven't read Ellis's novel, but...
yeah, just for the record, neither have I.
But I cannot help but feel knowing that, having read a significant amount about how much was adapted, right, and how truthful the spirit was to the adaptation, I can't help but feel that this big anxiety about it being, the most shockingly violent text ever, right, has very little to do with the actual violence and more to do with, as you said, the fact that in this story, we're reminded that we don't actually in the real world treat these people as monsters, right? This is not the, Marquis de Sade where we're like, well, obviously he's gross and disgusting. This is not Silence of the Lambs where we're like, well, of course he's a notorious serial killer. Christian Bale as Bateman, as well as Bateman the character, are depicted as not, they're doing monstrous things, but we're reminded that no one sees them as monsters, even when they wholeheartedly confess.
Exactly. Then I think that's where this leads us to a good discussion of the end of the film, which is a little bit, some critics have criticized it for getting a little too abstract and just being out there. But I don't know if I 100% agree with those criticisms of it.
I don't think I do, because of what you said earlier, and that is that this film is giving us, if we go back to the thing I have to talk about every time, the source of horror, right? This film is giving us
it's important. It is important. As we've seen time and time again throughout our discussion of various horror texts, the horror texts that are usually most effective are usually the ones that have the most clear, direct, and articulated source of horror.
And I think sometimes in films when I felt like they've gone off the rails or they went somewhere that felt too abstract or unexpected, it's because the film kind of deviated from the source of horror, or it became grab bag-y there at the end. But in American Psycho, the source of horror is the spectrum, right? It's not one extreme or the other. It is the spectrum and the fact that we find ourselves toggling back and forth uncomfortably from one end to the other. And I think the only way to carry that forward is to have an ending of this film be the way it is, where it is a little bit fractured, and it gets a little ridiculous. I think one of my favorite moments is when he shoots the cop car and it blows up, and then he looks at it like, what is happening?
Like, right? How did that happen?
Yeah, we need that, right? We need it to get over the top because we need it to be quickly oscillating back and forth between either end of the spectrum, right? Is it disgusting to be consumed or to be the consumer? Yes. We need it back and forth, and we need it to build up in speed until the film ends. So I don't have a problem with it because I don't think it could have ended any other way and maintained that source of horror.
And I think the way it does end is perfect for the source of horror and drives it home, like what you were saying, because we don't 100% know what has happened. He talks to his lawyer at the end, and he totally confesses to all these things, but the lawyer doesn't seem to know what he's talking about. The guy who he killed is still alive. Maybe he says that he's still alive. And I guess we're supposed to believe him. Why though? Which the film kind of like asks you to ask yourself that, like, why should you just believe this lawyer? Why? What reason?
So when you read about the film, when you read people praising or criticizing it, it's interesting the number of people that are really obsessed with being able to identify the number of people that Bateman for sure killed versus the number that are made up, right? Because either you believe he killed everyone, he killed no one, or he killed and there's like a precise number, right? Like this person, but not that person, but this person.
I just would like to, I think that reveals a larger problem within the system and within individual mindset that you need to know exactly how many people he killed so you can decide how bad of a person he is. It's like, I can rationalize this because we've been taught in this capitalist society that everyone has monetary value, everyone has a certain amount of worth, and well, if he only killed this many, then he's bad for sure, but I guess he's bad enough he can still work on Wall Street though. He's not bad enough to lose his job or that I should really hate him. Not a great bloke, but whatever. That's wild. What? No.
Yes. Yeah, we've been taught that there are thresholds of what is or is not acceptable.
And and the film doesn't answer it. As much as like I'm sure these theories on the internet, these people really have lots of evidence, and I'm sure that they can make a compelling argument. I think that the ending and why doesn't ultimately matter, because whether he did or he didn't doesn't matter. He could have, and he could have gotten away with it because of his place and how much money he had.
My partner who has an interpretation of the ending that very much aligns with that, and that is that she argued that Jared Leto's character was murdered, but what the ending is actually showing us is that his family has enough money to make it disappear, right? So that even one's death becomes inconsequential if you have enough money to be able to make that be the case. And
yeah, because his death could really, if it's found out that these Wall Street people, and it becomes really public information that they kill people and they're able to do this and get away with it, what could that possibly do to the system?
Exactly.
Anything that could challenge the system, it can just be made to go away. Because the most important thing is keeping this system, no matter how terrible it is.
And so the ambiguous ending works because the message, right, that source of horror is there ever going to be an answer that's not gross? Right? Is there, in this system, is there ever going to be a version that is not broken and corrupt? And it really doesn't matter, again, if you're the one enjoying the viewing and the consuming, or if you're the one being consumed. Either way, you're in a place that's not an acceptable place. And the fact that it is very clearly identified as being in an America that we consider to be a financial heyday, right? Should not be lost on the viewers.
Mm-mm.
What I have found very interesting about our conversation, and this is going to be a strange place, I realized, to end the conversation by talking about what we didn't talk about, but I want to end by just saying that one of the things we didn't even talk about were the female characters, which, you know, are to varying degrees just objects, but, you know, we have two incredible actresses in this film, Reese Witherspoon and Chloe Sevigny, who have really, you know, gone on to do some works later where they play very powerful women. And I think it's interesting that we can have a film that gives us, actually, compared to any other character, fairly developed characters, right? As much as any character is developed. And yet, just like anyone in this film, no one really matters. And so, you know, I know that this film gets criticized a lot for being, I think, very sexist, and it's hard not to feel that way when you have, you know, the amount of sex scenes and, like, literal eating of female flesh as this film does.
Right.
But I'm not sure that a film can be sexist when it's really just, what is the word? Misanthropic. Like, I don't know if a film can really be criticizing or belittling a sex when it's really just saying we're all gross. And that's what makes this film so good, in my opinion.
I think that there is a difference from portraying a sexist character and a patriarchal society, which both of those are at play in this film, and being a film that is sexist. Exactly. I think there is a distinction there. Like, without a doubt, Patrick Bateman is sexist, and this whole workplace is clearly built on patriarchal values. Like, you don't see any women in leadership roles. That is clear. That is an undeniable fact. However, I don't think you're supposed to think it's a good thing. The film certainly doesn't do anything to make you think it's a good thing. And so I think it would be kind of, I don't know, you're missing the point if you are like, this film doesn't do justice to its female characters. Like, could it really, in like with the characters that it has in the system that is present? You're asking it to do something that would be untrue to the world that it's creating.
I think that at the end of the day, this film forces us to ask, in a world where everyone is monsters, what are we supposed to call them? And the answer is America. But like, what do we call
America? We are Americans. It's like that line from Us.
Exactly. We are going to shift gears for our next episode and talk about another film that's a cult classic, but for very different reasons, and that film is...
Yeah, it's 1981's The Evil Dead, written and directed by Sam Raimi.
So we are very excited to do this, and we're going to go through all of our Evil Dead films. Not all at once, but we're going to make our way through all of it. So be excited, and in the meantime, please be sure to...
go ahead and leave us a rating or review wherever you get your podcasts from. And be sure to follow our social media, which is in our description. And tell your friends about us. Share us. Get us out there. We'd love to have more people to talk about horror with.
Thank you very much.